Welcome to a new year, 2015, new episode. But we're going to be talking about a unfortunately old issue that's been happening in America today. We're going to talk about homelessness. And unfortunately, this is a problem that is very much within our reach to solve. And we're going to kind of find some ways to do the work that needs to be done. But, just to kind of give you guys a quick rundown on some of the facts when it comes to homelessness, let's look at a couple of, of just sort of like where the facts and figures and numbers are. Okay, so on any given night in America, 600,000 of our fellow Americans are without, permanent shelter. 138,000 of those are children, okay? 57,000 of that 600,000 are veterans. These are men and women who served their country, the richest country in the world, and have been literally left out in the cold. Causes of homeless in America include the plain and simple fact that worsening inequality has made it harder and harder to afford rent in many places across the country. Another cause is domestic violence and other forms of abuse, which, depending on what surveys you look at, is the cause of 90% of women, teenagers, children for being homeless. 5 million homes were foreclosed upon, and the lack of a social safety net to provide access to affordable housing has left many homeless in the last 8 years. And despite all of this, we have many cities, states, and the federal government simply not doing enough. In fact, there are some city councils that are criminalizing the homeless, and they are making it illegal and a criminal act to sleep in public, to sleep in your own car, to loiter. It's that loitering is being treated as if it were a threat to public safety. But the interesting thing is that, you don't have to worry if you are doing this outside of the Apple Store or Best Buy, and it's Black Friday. That won't get you in trouble. But if you're just trying to survive and make it through one more night, you will be in trouble with some cities across the country with homelessness and the way it's being criminalized. To help us humanize some of these facts a little bit more, I'm really, really glad to introduce our special guest for this first segment of the show, Eric Jonathan Sheptock. He has been known as the homeless advocate. He has been an amazing, amazing voice for struggling families in Washington, D.C. for almost 10 years. The D.C. City Council recently honored his service by making December 31st, 2014, Eric Jonathan Sheptock Day, and we thank you very much for being on the show, Eric.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So, Eric, you got to hear some of the facts that I opened the show with, and what I guess I'm kind of curious about is, one of the other facts that we're dealing with today is that it is snowing in Washington, D.C. The original forecast called for something like a half inch of snow. That quickly kind of got rewritten, and because the snow kept falling. Now, for many people, that's just kind of a snow day from school or work, but it poses a very different challenge if you're struggling with shelter. I was wondering if you can give us an idea of what a day like today is like for our homeless fellow Americans.
Well, fortunately here in D.C., we do have a right to shelter if the temperature, including the heat index or the wind chill factor, is 32 and below or 95 and above. If it's between 33 and 94, then you don't have a right to shelter. It doesn't matter if it's raining, doesn't matter if it's a storm. Every so often you can count on the good graces of the shelter employees to let you in if it's a really bad rain. But you don't have a right to shelter in extreme weather. It's all just based on the temperature, and the advocates have really been fighting against that to try to make it where any extreme weather would be reason to keep the shelter open.
Right, because I mean, just a few years ago, Superstorm Sandy, I mean, that was an extreme weather event. But I don't recall the temperatures, at least in this part of the country. I don't recall the temperatures, falling below or above those thresholds that you were talking about. So, how do families deal with those kinds of situations?
Well, in terms of the weather, the families actually have the easiest time, only because once they're in the family shelter, they can stay in. They don't get put out. But the homeless individuals, as soon as it gets above 32 degrees, the shelter can be closed if it's between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Well, the families a few years ago, that they actually did get put out when it got to 33. That was a really terrible thing, because you had parents with 6-month-old babies, and when it got up to 33 degrees, if you were in the overflow part of the shelter, you got put out. The ones who have the actual apartment style units in the family shelter could stay, but the ones who were sleeping on the dining room floor because there was no rooms left actually had to leave. And I felt really badly that it gets to be 33, 34 degrees, and you got a tiny baby less than a year old, and you have to walk out into the weather, because it's above freezing.
Yeah. So now you've actually, you've actually borne witness to this yourself, and I was wondering if you could, tell us more about that experience, because I think eyewitness is the most important testimony we have on these issues.
Yeah. Well, I should say that I'm an indoor homeless person. I actually do stay inside of a shelter, but I have stepped outside, just not in a while. But in April of last year, there was a late freeze around April 15th, I believe it was. And so on the morning of April 16th, I was contacted by a relatively new news lady who was working for Channel 7, who had been referred to me by Sam Ford. And they were asking me about these two guys that actually froze by I-295 here in Southeast. And what happens is that many of the homeless, especially those who stay outdoors, don't get the news. And so if we do get something like a late freeze, then they don't know it's coming, and they stay out in the elements, and then we find them dead. We count the homeless every year, and we also have a ceremony for the homeless who died every year. So we had the ceremony for those who died last month, and then this month, in about 2 weeks, we'll be counting the homeless. And so in January of 2013, we counted 6,859 homeless people. In January of 14, we counted 7,748. That's an increase of 889, or 13%. And I was upset by the immediate response from DC government. They actually said very little about it. They weren't appalled by it, but I was. But
how did they? What was their explanation for? For that increase. Because there are. That's clearly a failure of our basic city civic services. But there are other factors that must have led to that increase. So how did they respond when they were questioned about it?
Well, that's just it. They actually didn't respond. See, every 2 months we have in DC what's called the Interagency Council on Homelessness meeting, the ICH. And that's where people from different departments of DC government come together to talk about what they're doing to end homelessness. And normally, after the count is done in January, the numbers are issued, or I should say published, around May. And at the following ICH meeting in June, we would talk about the reason for the increase or the decrease. But this past June, they didn't do that. And that's what I meant when I said that there was a immediate response, because I brought it up, and I said, why didn't you talk about this at the meeting? And the ones who I confronted about that, who normally do the report out, said we weren't asked to. And I thought that was kind of fishy.
Yeah.
You get this 13% increase in homelessness, and you got all these people that get paid $100,000 a year to try to end it, and we have this 10-year plan that failed, and nobody is saying anything. And I should also say, you mentioned Eric Jonathan Sheptock Day. Well, the irony or the coincidence is that in 2004, DC government had a 10-year plan to end homelessness. In 2007, they scrapped it because they weren't meeting benchmarks. But if it had continued, it would have ended homelessness on or by the last day of 2014,
14,
which is the day they gave me.
Yeah, yeah. So what were some of those milestones that, I mean, you said that they were meeting some milestones but not meeting others. So what were some of the milestones that got met?
Well, no. Actually, I said they weren't meeting any milestones.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
yeah, and
Okay.
and so actually that's about the time that I began advocating. They made the plan in '04. I came to DC in '05. Actually, I'm not from DC, and in '06 I began advocating for the homeless, and then in '07 they scrapped the plan. And I don't really have the facts as to what benchmarks they weren't meeting. I just found what I could online about that issue, and no one's talking about it. No one's talking about why they scrapped the plan or what failed, and DC government is really bad, when it comes to that. They don't talk about their failures. Then if you don't talk about your failures, you can't fix them.
Right.
And so that's part of what we end up with. And in recent months, I've even said, we should talk about what failed and why it failed. And I've been called a pessimist when I said that. To me, it's not being a pessimist, it's being a planner.
Right, right. I mean, if anything, it's being a realist.
Yes, exactly.
And so, I mean, from a realist viewpoint, what should we be looking forward to? This 2015, we have a new mayor, Mayor Muriel Bowser. I've heard that that you got to meet her when City Council honored you, but I was wondering if you and her have had a chance, or anybody from your team and her team have had a chance to talk and make some plans for this winter.
Well, we haven't had any chances to do that yet. I've actually met her a bunch of different times when she was on the council for 7.5 years. She knows who I am, and I also got to speak to her for a couple of minutes at Miriam's Kitchen, place that serves the homeless. She went down there for a photo op / press conference on December 29th. And I got to speak to her then. I'll speak to her again this coming Thursday. There's a WIN meeting. That is the Washington Interfaith Network. It's a collaboration of about 50 different churches who do grassroots advocacy work. Mm-hmm. And they'll be meeting at St. Augustine Church at 15th and V Northwest. So it's right around the corner from the Reeves Building, and that'll be at 7 p.m. And I'll be there, and Wynn will ask her some questions and get her to commit to some different promises. And Wynn has said in the past that they're going to go back and confront the politicians if they don't follow through on their promises. Well, let's see if they do that. Let's hope.
Right.
Yes, and so I will get that chance, and I will also be in her office within a few days to arrange for a meeting.
Okay.
Yes, and so, but I should say also that something that has been working, that's had limited success, mm-hmm. is the Permanent Supportive Housing Program.
Okay. And
that's a program that houses disabled homeless people, mentally and physically disabled. And for what it's worth, it is working. It is getting people housed. However, it's not housing people at a faster rate than they're becoming homeless. So I'm glad that the most vulnerable are being helped, but then we have to find a way to get ahead of the ball and to actually house people more quickly than they become homeless. And that kind of leads into what I think should be done, because, well, first of all, I should say that when the government begins these programs, the funding is not guaranteed, and so every year you have to go down and fight again to get these programs funded. So it was actually Adrian Fenty, 2 mayors back, who began permanent supportive housing. It was due to a federal initiative, so I don't want to give him too much credit, but the feds put forth an initiative, and then Fenty grabbed it and began PSH. And then Gray actually decreased the funding, and then we didn't have as many people getting housed, and now our number of homeless folk is going up. But what I would say is that we have to also give some attention to those who can work, the able-bodied homeless, or we call mm-hmm. them ABODs for short, mm-hmm. Because we have many people who are able to work and who just need a little help getting started,
right?
And they're just kind of lingering in shelter, and yet by the time we help them, they'll be retirement age, and they won't be able to work.
Right. And I'm glad that you're bringing up the ABODs, because it's such a, I think, like, some of the things that maybe some of our audience takes for granted is just showing up for a job interview and being able to leave like not having to bring all your possessions with you to a job interview so that, you can show this potential employer that, you're the right person for the job and, that you've got what it takes, but at the same time not having to worry about the security of your belongings. It's things like that. Things I think, being like even like interview training and preparation, and just getting connected to those opportunities. They're just such basic needs when it comes to people wanting to work, like you're describing, but facing some obstacles on the way to employment. Do you mind elaborating a little bit more?
Sure. There's this classic story that I love to throw around because it really drives the point home. There was a woman in Tupelo, Mississippi, I guess it's a couple years ago now, who had become homeless. She'd been homeless for 3 months, so she was not like this long-term homeless person, and she'd been looking for work. And finally, she got an interview at Kentucky Fried Chicken, and so then she shows up for her first day of work. And it turns out her employer had found out between the interview date and her first day of work that she was homeless. So when she showed up, he turned her around and he told her, "Don't come back until you have a home, and your own home and your own transportation." And there's something fundamentally wrong with that. How do you get your own home and your own transportation if you don't have a job?
Right.
And so she actually made it through the interview process, got the job, and then got turned away because she was homeless.
Right.
And that really makes the point about how a lot of employers just don't want to hire, homeless people. And so it's a catch-22. You're homeless because you don't have a job. Now you can't get a job because you're homeless. And there are homeless people who before Obama phones, that they had to give the shelter number as their contact when looking for a job because they had no cell phone. And then what would happen is that the shelter employee was trained to answer the phone by saying, "Hello, such and such shelter, how can I help you?" And as soon as the employer heard that it was a shelter,
it's a giveaway.
Yes, he would withdraw the job offer. And so, I think that you actually lose your right to call somebody a lazy bum if you won't let them work and you won't offer them a job. And here in DC, we actually had another classic case of it where in like February of 2013, there was an article in the paper about how DC government was going to shut down a successful job training program. It was a pilot program for TANF families, those on temporary assistance for needy families.
Right.
And 11 people were involved in the pilot, all homeless parents. 10 of them were on track to succeed. They were still in the program. And one had had a stroke and couldn't work anymore. And they were working on 2 vacant buildings here in Southeast DC on Wayne Place. And the government said that they just couldn't continue it. And they spent $6,000 training each person. They weren't complaining about that. They spent $500 on tools for each person. They weren't complaining about that. But it cost $2.6 million to renovate the 2 buildings, which in DC standards is not a lot of money.
Right.
But then they were taking the money from the Department of Human Services and from the Department of Employment Services. And for them, that was a lot of money. Normally, that money would come from economic development. And so you take the money from the wrong part of the budget, and then those departments say we can't foot the bill for renovating 2 buildings because we're human services and we're employment services and we're not economic development.
Right.
And then the government shuts down a successful program where all 11 people wanted to work and were doing well until the one had a stroke. And then it gets even crazier because 2 months later, in April of 2013, then Deputy Mayor of Health and Human Services, Bibi Otero, issued a statement where she strongly implied that homeless parents were just kind of lazy and shiftless and just didn't want to work.
Oh,
and that they just wanted to be somewhere where they can get free rent and free food and free transit. And this is the same government that 2 months earlier was saying we're going to shut down this successful job training program because we just can't foot the bill.
Right.
So how do you jump from one to the other so quickly?
Right. I mean, I'm glad that you're sharing this with us because like these are, just examples of the most, basics when it comes to, you hear people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and, these are the most concrete examples that we can get, and yet, and we're living in a city that's supposed to be the right political climate for for addressing some of these kinds of challenges. So I guess looking forward in 2015, if what would be your advice to people who are listening to the show right now, folks who are trying to figure who have heard a lot of what you've shared with us and are really interested in like moving the ball forward? What's your advice? Like, what's like the next best thing that they can do, and what's the follow up after that?
Okay, well, my focus for this year and even for the last part of last year is all around homeless employment, because I should say that it will really challenge the city. See, because the city officials, at least in the previous administration, will put forth this message, of homeless people being lazy, and so let's do different things to help get homeless people connected to jobs, and you'll see that many of them do want to work, and some of them, about half of them, actually work at least part-time, some full-time, and so people need work boots. They need help with transit, getting to work. It's very hard to get transit support, for when you're looking for a job and you need to go around to all these different interviews. There are nonprofits that will help you with transit fare for your first 2 weeks of work. But what about the interview process?
Right.
And so we need help in those kinds of ways. We need spaces for people to meet in order to talk through that there are different issues related to work and finding work. Some kind of employment support group. Need a place where they can meet. We need food for those meetings, because a lot of times people have to forgo eating at the free soup kitchens in order to attend meetings that are going to help them improve their lives.
Right.
So you have to make tough choices oftentimes between going to work and going to shelter. If you go to work, you lose your shelter bed in some cases.
Right.
If you go to work, you miss out on the free food. And if you don't have enough money to buy food on you right at that time, then I've actually worked 8 hours in 95-degree weather when I lived in Florida because I didn't have any money, to buy lunch. And that's not easy.
Yeah.
And so there are various ways in which we can support the homeless. And I would say that an idea I've been tossing around for a few years now is the idea of a website where people can go on and say, I'm going to donate this much to the homeless at this location on this day, whether it's food or it's work boots, because I've seen where, like, on one particular Palm Sunday, I ate 2 plates at a place called Martha's Table on 14th and V.
Mm-hmm.
I walked down a mile to Franklin Park, and within 2 hours, 6 groups were feeding. And after about the 4th group, I was like, look, stop feeding me. I'm full. I can't eat anymore. But that kind of made me think that if we had a website where people could say what they're going to donate,
right,
then once this location gets saturated with food, you can donate transit fare and work boots and haircuts and various things that people need to get to work. And then of course
right,
we have to have that website where people can go and look and see what's going on. Otherwise you're just running around town hoping
right,
that homeless people will be in this or that location.
Right. And and I think that this kind of help, the kind of help that you're talking about, is really to help our fellow Americans not have to face these false choices of, do you eat or do you work? Do you work or do you lose your shelter? I mean, these are just simply the kinds of choices that, citizens of the richest country in the world should not be, forced to make.
Right.
And, and I'm really grateful for your, insight and for, coming on the show and describing some of this. I understand that you're also a part-time journalist, that you're a correspondent in your own right. Mm-hmm. Where can our audience continue to follow your voice, your work, and continue to be part of your efforts?
Well, you can find out anything you want about me, right down to my shoe size, by Googling my name, Eric. That's ERIC. The last name is Sheptock, SHEPTOCK. If you get it wrong, Google will actually autocomplete it for you because they're so familiar with me. So it's Eric Sheptock on my Facebook page. I have a blog which you can reach by going to ericsheptock.com. and you just put in Eric Sheptock in Google, and everything about me will come up, including every video of me, and everything that I've written, and various articles that I've been interviewed for by the Washington Post and other media outlets.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show, Eric. We really appreciate your time. We're going to have links to Eric Sheptock's blog and Facebook page on our Facebook page. So look forward to a whole bunch of new audience members trying to help you out with your amazing work. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Right. Thank you for having me.
And you guys have been listening to Dr. America, and we will be right back.